Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be here at Google. He forgot to tell you that I won an iPod from Google at the Agile conference, but I was talking to Google people in the back of the room and they gave it to somebody else. So this is the consolation prize. I get to come and give a talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about Scrum, and it's actually going to be a lot about Google. Because I thought the paper that was presented at the Agile conference on Google's implementation of Agile in Adwords is very interesting. So I'm going to be talking a lot about that. And my day job is CTO of a healthcare company, but because I was the guy that started the first Scrum, I've actually spent a lot of time traveling around the world talking about Scrum. And I've typically been a CT and VP of engineering, and in 4 companies I've tried to figure out what worked, and in the 5th company we implemented Scrum. 4 companies later, Scrum is just like it was in the beginning. The basics of Scrum was started in 1993. I do a lot of Scrum training. There's a short list for the next month. You can see I'm in Europe a lot, sometimes down in South America, a little bit in the United States. Agile began, as we know it today, at the Agile Manifesto meeting in 2001. 17 of us got together in Utah at Snowbird, and we spent 3 days arguing passionately, and we had one brief moment of clarity and wrote down what's on the slide. and most of you, I think, know the Agile principles, that it's really the individuals and the interactions between the individuals that build great software. That's a lot of what Google's all about. That working software is really the only real measure of progress, and that working closely with the customer or the customer proxy, someone who represents the customer working closely with the engineering team is central to an Agile process. And finally, responding to change. It used to be only about 40% of requirements changed on the average project in the industry, but in the 2003 report of the Stanford Group, that number had moved up to between 60 and 65% of requirements changed during a project. Google already knows this, but some people are still trying to make a plan, and then they create a change control group, okay, which is the kiss of death for successful projects these days. So there were 3 people from Scrum there, 4 XP people, although Martin Fowler is an author. DSDM is a process in Europe. Crystal, Alistair Coburn has his own process he's written several books on, and then a number of consultants and authors of books. Those were the guys that wrote the manifesto, and it was kind of like throwing a bottle into the ocean with a note in it. And everybody read it all over the world. So things have been amazing ever since. Scrum is a worldwide movement. Agile is a worldwide movement, but particularly Scrum. The highest per capita Scrum people in the world are in Finland, mainly because of Nokia. When I was thinking about Scrum, there were some interesting ideas, at least I thought they were interesting, and they certainly were important to the way Scrum works. There's actually a lot of thinking and history behind it. I had spent about 15 years working with entrepreneurs in the Valley here who were in a nonprofit organization. They had all done great things at companies that preceded Google. They had cashed in, and they were retired at 30, and what were they going to do to make the world a better place? Well, they had to build really good team processes to do public service kinds of things, and their goal was to get small working teams to work with the entrepreneurial spirit that they saw in their startup companies. So how do you do that? So all that kind of thinking is built into Scrum. Scrum is derived primarily from Japanese best practices, from Takeuchi Nonaka, and so it has a strong lean component to it. The leading example of that today is, of course, Toyota, so I'm going to be mentioning a little bit about Toyota. And finally, I was on the board of Accion, which is the leading micro-enterprise development organization in the Western Hemisphere. They work primarily in South America. And that's of immediate interest because the Green Bank and Yunus in Bangladesh got the Nobel Prize a couple of weeks ago. They are the leading micro-enterprise development organization in the Eastern Hemisphere. And the way we set up the small teams and gave them a little bit of money to start up their own businesses and work together, that kind of thinking is embedded in Scrum. There's also a lot of research behind it. I don't have a lot of time to go into this. I think maybe one of the things that might interest the technical people here at Google is when I was just preceding the time when Scrum began. I had a little object database company on the MIT campus, and another startup asked me for some space. They wanted 2 small rooms, and the company is now known as iRobot. iRobot was started by Rodney Brooks at MIT, who said, we've been trying to build a smart system for 30 years. We tried to build the biggest database we could with all the knowledge in the world in it. We tried to build the biggest processor in the sky we could build that could compute on the world's biggest whiteboard, and it was virtually a complete and total failure. So he said, I'm going to do something totally different. I'm going to build a system that has no database. It only has sensors. The world's the database. And it will have no central processor. It will have a processor on a leg, on the spine, and it will have a blank neural network chip we will plug into its head. And when we turn it on, by simple rules, it will self-organize, learn to walk, and then run around, and it would run into my office trying to hunt me down with infrared sensors. Now they're using it in Iraq, the same kind of technology, dropping it into urban settings in Iraq. But the thing that robot got me thinking about is, how do you build a really high performance team out of typical developers? We were producing a tool that had to be used by your average developer at Ford Motor Company, an IT guy in Ford Motor. How could we turn him into a Googly kind of guy? Well, it was all about the team process, and that's how Scrum began. I've got a lot of slides to get through, so I'm not going to go into real detail anymore on the background of Scrum. Only to say that it's driven largely by Japanese best practice. Fujio Cho was the president of Toyota America in 2002. He's now the chairman of the board of Toyota. It's really interesting to hear what he says in an interview, because he basically is a mouthpiece for Agile principles. We didn't talk about Toyota. We didn't talk about him when we came up with these things. But when you ask him, well, how do you think about getting work done in Toyota? He wants people to actually do something. If they've got a new car, let's do a prototype in a couple of months and take a look at it and see how it looks. And then when we look at it, we'll see, well, it's really not quite what we want. Here's the reasons why it's wrong. Let's do it again and see if we can do it better. And that process keeps happening, and after we fail enough times and pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, we move to a higher level of performance. Okay, that's what Toyota is all about. That's the way they think. So what is Google all about? Here's the Google way. In 2001, I don't know is Rosen still here at Google? No, he's long gone. In 2001, he got rid of all the managers. But I understand you have a few back. Do we have any managers in the room? Were you here when that happened? No. And basically, he wanted the teams to be small and take their own responsibility and self-organize and get their own work done. And some of that flavor still exists here in Google. The only problem with that is that when you get into larger projects, and this was interesting to me about Adwords, when you've got 5 different organizations in different parts of the world, and when it's not an independent project, but like almost every other Google product has to somehow interact with Adwords, right? At least that's the way I understand it. And so how do those 5 teams work together and put stuff out that supports maybe hundreds of teams out there and have it all make sense? You need a little bit of organization, okay? So that's one of the reasons why Adwords started to think about Agile. Now, one of the interesting ways to think about this is the way organizations work. This is a modified version of what's in the Toyota way. Organizations typically they will typically start up in 1 or 2 ways, usually a little combination of both. You'll have a brilliant guy who's the CEO, and he has an autocracy. What you do is how the CEO feels today. I work with some startups like that, talking about Scrum. And if you have a brilliant person who's really good with people and can really get money and generate great product, it becomes very successful. I don't know, Google may have been a little bit like that in the beginning, I don't know. The problem is it doesn't scale Once the company starts to get too big, they can't depend on what that one person is thinking today to get stuff done. Other companies, they don't have anybody in charge. It's just kind of organic. Maybe this is more Googly-like. That's the way Yahoo started. I've done a lot of work over at Yahoo, and it was very organic. People did their own thing in their own way, and what they found is that didn't scale. So at Yahoo, they went out and they hired some consultants who gave them a big heavyweight process and 300-page specifications. And when I got there a year or two ago, they said, we really hate this. And when they learned about Agile and particularly Scrum, they said, Scrum would allow us to go back to our organic roots and work in small teams in the same way, but give us the kind of structure that Toyota has, where people are empowered, but there's a structure there that allows scalability. And what we're seeing is that Scrum is really infinitely scalable. And in some projects, I don't know if we'll get a chance to talk about today, but actually it's linearly scalable. i.e., if you double the number of people on a well-run Scrum, you actually double the output of software. It's the only process that has ever documented it with good data, that phenomenon. So it's interesting then to look at Adwords, which needed a little bit more structure. So they had to move from that organic state up into a more, a little bit of a leadership-driven organization where there are people making their own rules and empowered, but having some rules that they're following so that they're coordinated together. And in looking at the paper that was presented at Agile 2006, it's interesting that at Adwords there was a core group, and there were designs presented to them, and there was a team, what we call in small talk the product owner. The person that owned that product presented it to a bunch of stakeholders, and then they made a decision on how to move forward, and they determined whether it was ready to move forward. Now, this is a very nice setup for Scrum, because one of the most important things in Scrum is you have a product owner who has a product backlog that's ready for implementation. Ready means the developers know enough that they can cleanly implement. So by having that already in place, 99% of the companies that I have don't have that. So Google was already a leg up. So we like to see in Scrum a product owner who owns that backlog, has a list of things that are prioritized, people are constantly adding to it, it's totally transparent and visible, it emerges, anybody can contribute, and so forth. In Adwords, the product owners held weekly meetings with stakeholders. Now this is really interesting, because in advanced Scrums, we have what's called a meta Scrum. My company runs a meta Scrum. The product owner, the chief product owner of the company, comes in every week and presents to the stakeholders in the company the product plan. All the product projects in motion, their state, and a recommendation for any tweaking of that plan. And in that meeting, usually our CEO is in that meeting, as well as a lot of other management type people and lead engineers and support and install people. In that meeting, the decisions that are made can redirect the process every week. So the company can navigate every week in a new direction based on what we call the meta Scrum. So Adwords already had a meta Scrum in place. So this is really unique, okay? Because companies take a long time to get to that state where they can really do that. So here's a little bit more about the product owner, defines the features, decides on the release date and content. This was all going on in Adwords. We like people to be concerned about profitability. I had lunch with some of the Adwords teams. They said, don't call us Adwords, we're the ka-ching team. So on that team, they know that they are, even the team knows they're responsible for profitability here at Google. So that's really good. In Scrum, we typically run in iterations of 30 days, although many Scrums run less, often 2 weeks, like XP teams, sometimes even 1 week Scrums. The product owner has the product vision, generates the direction and looks at what the result is and whether it's good, bad, and so forth. The kind of meta Scrum we have at Patient Keeper is actually very similar. Patient Keeper has one of the most advanced Scrum implementations in the world. And when the product owner comes into that meeting, he talks about what the team accomplished last week, what they will accomplish the next week, what are the impediments. Those are the 3 issues in Scrum that we're always asking in the daily Scrum meetings. And all product decisions are made in that meta Scrum. Things are started, stopped, resources are changed, and so forth. So Adwords had some good things to start with, but they were having trouble delivering in the time that they thought they could deliver, and trouble integrating, working across geographies and integrating with other teams. And they felt that they needed a little bit more process. Do we have anybody from Adwords here? Yeah, half of you guys showed up, okay. So correct me if I make any misstatements, but this is what Mark wrote about you guys, so this is actually his words. He was very concerned about introducing any process because it might get resistance here at Google. And so the strategy was to do something as simple as possible, as little as possible first. And he knew a lot about Scrum. It's really helpful to have somebody that really knows this. A lot of companies I see try to implement Agile by doing 1 or 2 or 3 practices, and they always choose the wrong ones and it doesn't work. So if you're going to introduce it by piece, you need the person making those decisions who has really gone through Agile implementations and knows that by not getting these pieces introduced, these are all the things that are going to break, and can kind of do blocking and tackling automatically while the team is kind of bootstrapping itself up. Here's the Scrum process in simple form. How many people know about Scrum, what it is? Most of you already know. So here's the framework as illustrated by Softhouse in Sweden. We have a product backlog. The team pulls. It's really important. It's a pull process, like the assembly line at Toyota. Pulls just the amount that they think they can get done in an iteration. When they pull those features off the product backlog, they break those down into development tasks. Estimate them, then they start into the iteration, daily meeting, everybody speaks to the 3 questions. It's all inspecting, adapting, inspecting, adapting, inspecting, adapting all the way through, and at the end you deliver working software. At Patient Keeper, every iteration delivers production software into large hospital groups. So our sprint demo at the end of a sprint is, let's turn on Mass General, hundreds of doctors and thousands of web users, and let's see if the phone rings in the next hour. That's the sprint demo. And if the phone doesn't ring and there are no outstanding issues, it was a great demo. That's our definition of done. We had a CEO that said, look, I'm tired of this done meaning maybe it's been unit tested. I want it done and then done, meaning it's system tested. And not only that, I want it done, so that it's acceptance tested by the users. And not only that, I want it done, meaning the user's alive, more than 1, at least 4, and there are no outstanding issues. That's done at Patient Keeper. It took us 4 years to get really done. Okay, so now we're always done at the end of the iteration. So what was introduced first into Adwords? The thought was by just providing some visibility into a release backlog. We're not going to do iterations yet. We're just going to have a release backlog, and we're going to watch the tasks being completed. We're going to look at the burn down chart for the release. And that looks like it might help. And we'll put it up on wiki pages. So here's the picture of Scrum that has flowed out of a paper I did in Agile 2005, where I said, you know, when you're starting off in Scrum, you're just trying to get a team to work. So I call that a type A Scrum. So you need a minimal amount of organization, and you're really trying to just get the flow. You're trying to get the flow of software delivery. So there's working code. You get to those iterations, you get kind of almost a heartbeat going. Boom, kaboom, kaboom. It's just working code. And if you execute well, it just gets faster and faster and faster. The problem for most people implementing Scrum is they have more than one team. They typically have a product portfolio. So how do you organize where you have more than one? You've got Adwords with 5 geographies working on Adwords. You know, you've got 30 other groups with multiple teams working on other things, and they all have to mesh. Okay? So now you need to add some different levels of planning. That's what I call a type B Scrum. And so that is, type B is directed towards making the product a winner. The issue with type B that I found in many companies is, you know, you can have the greatest software but not win in the market. If the company is not agile enough to move in a way to both deal with competition and drive into the sweet spot of the customer, somebody else can get there first with inferior technology. We see that all the time. Silicon Valley is littered with great technologies that never made it. So I said, how can we take Scrum up a notch? How can we drive Scrum right up into the CXO suite so the entire company becomes agile? And for us, it's really weekly iterations. On a weekly basis, the company can change directions, change resources, change plan, change projects, change product on a weekly basis. So there's some things you need to introduce at a type C level. So what I tried to show here is that Google AdWords, when they started, they had a release roadmap. They didn't have an iteration burn down chart, but they were implementing a release burn down, and they had the meta Scrum that was kind of driving things. So these were the pieces that they started with. So in adopting these practices, one of the interesting things is the question was posed to the engineers, what are the biggest impediments in priority order that we're facing? And then by looking at what's at the top of the impediment list, what practice could we bring in that would take that problem off the top of our problem list? Okay, so it's a very interesting way to introduce Agile. And as a result, the engineers sort of self-chose or at least agreed that the best practice to bring in was going to address their biggest problem. And it was done in a way to maintain the self-organizing character of the teams, and the person doing it was able to stay a little bit removed from the teams and not get involved too much in their messing around with things. So in the Scrum, of course, we have the Scrum Master that has that responsibility. And the Scrum Master needs to really work the issues between the customer and the team, show the customer or the product organization how to maximize the return on investment by really helping the team to be effective, improving the lives of the team, improving the productivity of the team, and improving the engineering practices of the team. So this is a major function of the Scrum Master in Scrum. So here is your burn down. Were any of you AdWord guys here when this was going on? Some of you. And what you have here is tasks. The numbers here, are they tasks or days or hours, or what was the metric? They're weeks. Okay, so 50 weeks of work, and some of the work is completed, you're burning down. Here, I think new work was added in, so instead of having the graph go up because some product owner jammed some new stuff into the pipe, you make it go down here so you can show that the team is just burning down nicely, but there's new work in here. Now the gap is bigger. The data is going to slip out when you do that. The burn down chart gives you that image really well. It works really well with management too. They can really get it really quickly by looking at what's going on with this. So that helped, but when they looked at their impediment list, they still have some problems. QA was testing features that really weren't complete or wasn't sure how to test them. Engineers were doing duplicate work. They were working on the same pieces of the code base and clashing. And there were dependencies between engineers that were not visible, so things were getting stuck or stopped and not flowing right. So the engineering team agreed that maybe a daily meeting, maybe the daily stand-up meeting would actually solve this, that the QA people could know what should be tested, what was ready. The engineers, if they had dependencies, could work out the dependencies, and people who were working on the same thing wouldn't be stepping on one another. So they decided to introduce the daily meetings. And when you do that initially, they can be long, but after a while, they start to get really short. Typically, they're 15 minutes in Scrum. We have a daily Scrum of Scrums at Patient Keeper that drives the whole engineering process. It's 15 minutes. At Patient Keeper, we actually have every developer come. It could be a group, maybe not quite as big as this, because we only have 30 or 40 engineers. But at the Scrum of Scrums, everybody comes. But we get through that meeting in 15 minutes. And it worked pretty well because the teams kind of picked it up and worked with it, and it was moving forward. But it still didn't solve the problem. And this is a really interesting thing to me, reading what happened. They estimated 3 weeks of work for a set of screens. And when they did low-level estimates, they came up to 40 points. Now, what was the metric on a point? How did you determine the size of a point? Just had it was like acorns. It's 40 acorns of work. And what they wanted to do was measure the velocity the first week, and the velocity was 8. 8 points got done. And then the second week, the second week was 7.5. And interestingly, the tech lead is the tech lead of that team here. There was he said, we've got 40 points. We did 8 points last week, 7 points this week, and we're going to be done next week. So even a really smart Google engineer can do something that doesn't make much sense when you don't have that visible picture. So at week 3, of course, the team implemented another 9 points, but still far from done. And the team lead said, well, we're just going to be done in another week. But then, in another week, the velocity actually slowed down. No way. So at the end of the day, this thing took 7 weeks, and they'd planned on 3, okay? So the question was, is there any Agile practice we can introduce that would help resolve this dilemma? So what was done was they took the same burn down chart and said, look, here's our burn down. The work is getting done. And we get down here, we got about 80% of the work done. But let's look at how many features were complete. How many features in the product backlog were fully complete? Only 20%. You're at almost the end of the iteration and you've got 80% of the work done and 20% of the features complete. What does that tell you? Even a Google engineer can reinvent work in progress is bad. They figured that out in Toyota about 50 years ago, okay? This is a bad thing. So you have to reduce that gap. And it was interesting in the paper that it apparently was a shock to the engineers to actually come to this realization. So they learned that they really needed a complete task. One of the things that happens in early Scrums is people choose what they're going to work on, but everybody chooses something different. So they're all running in parallel streams. What does that do? It maximizes your work in progress. What did I just say? That's bad. Bad, okay? You want to look at it and say, okay, how can we work so we complete a feature as quickly as possible? You might have to put 3 people on one feature. So we sequence out the feature. That's going to minimize our work in progress, lower our risk, and make our dates realistic. Another thing, just to mention, Over at Palm, they have this big time and the stuff they're working on. A lot of stuff you bring into iteration, you don't really know if you can deliver at the end. So what you want to do is, XP has this concept called the spike. What you want to do is bring it in as an R&D task, and the goal is to time box that task and come out with information that allows you to make the decision about the next step. And that information that allows you to make the decision is the done for that piece in that iteration. That works really well. I don't know how much of your stuff is spikes. What percentage of AdWords is spikes? Very small. Over at Palm, about 50% of what they're doing on some of the new technology, because it's both hardware and software, is spikes. So on the first projects, they felt good that the tools were better, better QA, more collaboration, but still didn't have good prioritization of features. They were missing dates. It was risky at the end, all these things, features not complete, work done, but features not complete meant that also that there's a lot of bugs hidden in the features that aren't complete. But at the end of the day, they found maintaining that release backlog was useful. It did solve some problems, but not all the problems. So the next step was to work with the product owners. Let's get a clear, prioritized list by business value. And the second thing that was chosen was, let's go to iteration-based development so that we can have more checkpoints on things being done and not allowing this work in progress to escape our grasp, but force it to closure at the end of every iteration. And they agreed to start with 2 weeks iterations. Is that what you're still doing, is 2 weeks iterations? Pretty much. So now you've got a few more things in there. You've straightened out the product backlog. You've got your daily meetings. You're working better with the product owners. You're starting into iterations, so you're actually going to start working out the sprint backlog and burn down chart issues, which I'll talk about next. One of the problems that they had was QA. I know there's a lot of work now going on testing, particularly at the unit testing level here at Google. It's really hard sometimes for people to get the QA into an iteration. So at the end of the iteration, when they're done, not only unit testing is complete, but system testing is complete. If you're not done with testing at the end of an iteration, how much work do you have in progress? 100%, right? We already found out that's a bad thing. Here's an interesting thing that you could think about here at Google for Agile. Nokia has, this is their criteria. They first started with, when are we doing iterations? They said, if iterations are longer than 6 weeks, we're not doing iterations. If they're not time boxed, we're not doing them. If the team tries to do too much planning up front, we're not doing them. If it doesn't deliver workable code, we're not doing them. If they don't include testing, they're not doing them. Okay, so where the AdWords group was right there, they wouldn't pass the Nokia test for iterations. You know you did not do Scrum. This is their Scrum test. Your backlog has to have estimates. You have to have a release burn down, know your velocity. The team needs to know who the product owner is. And there is a Scrum Master involved with the team. That's their litmus test for Scrum. And they say that's really helped Nokia. It is such a big company with so many hundreds of teams. It's really helped them be effective in delivering product. So here's a done kind of chart that we use in the Certified Scrum Master training showing the idea, one way to improve your process is to extend the definition of done. So if all you're getting is coding done, then you want to extend the definition to get a little more, to get your unit testing done. And then if you're getting that done, then you want to push for getting the whole quality assurance done. And once you get that done, you want to push for getting to the end of the iteration and have performance testing done. And once you get there, you want to push for, let's get some user acceptance or piloting. And if you can get that far, why not go all the way? Why not just boot it live worldwide at the end of every iteration. Okay, that's effectively what Patient Keeper does, although it's not worldwide. It's just into maybe 4 large multi-hospital systems. Okay, if you do that, it forces you to streamline every aspect of your operation. It's like lowering the water level in a river. The rocks all start sticking up. They're the impediments, the waste, things that need to be fixed and pulled out of the system. So they had release burn downs, but then they began to introduce iteration burn downs. They're starting to do iterations now, so they actually have the real sprint burn down chart. So, and the iteration burn down guides the development efforts, and the release burn down from the product owner's point of view is the product release milestone. Is it going to be met? Here's the way Scrum looks at the sprint backlog, usually small tasks, on the average a day or 8 hours. Team members, it's always a pull system. The people are always choosing their own work, pulling what they can do, and so forth. Here's a typical Scrum board that's used in a lot of companies. I don't know if do you use these in Adwords at all? Developers will start off, they'll put a story, if they use user stories for requirements, and then there'll be a certain number of tasks to be used with the user story. Then when the developers in their daily meetings will be standing in front of this board, are the QA tests ready for this story? The developer will say, okay, I'm going to start working on this. They'll move it over to in implementation. When the development is done and probably unit tested, they move it over to this column and say, hey, QA, you have it. When QA is done, they move it over to the done column. Here, the Scrum Master has got the burn down chart there. It's a great way of providing, using a kind of an information radiator to show everybody what's going on in the project. Anybody in the company can walk by this board, and in 3 seconds, they know the state of this project. And in some companies, like in Stockholm, St. Jude Medical have these lava lamps that you have around here. They have it connected to that chart, and it goes red, green, or yellow. The CEO really likes that. He just walks around, he looks and sees if there's any red lights. Now, the interesting thing about this implementation of Google, and the thing that registered to me that this was a good one, is that Mark had to go on a 3-week vacation, and he was really concerned what would happen. And when he came back, it was all running by itself. So the key to being a really good project leader or Scrum Master is that you're so good they don't need you. And it exercises, there's actually a number of quotes I could have pulled out of the Tao Te Ching, but this is the one I chose. You know, he who acts spoils. So this is a Googly way of thinking. I mean, this is embedded in the Google culture. If you try to force something, it gets spoiled. He who grasps, the project leader who tries to grasp that project causes it to slip. Because he does not grasp, he does not let it slip. This is what Mark was effectively executing, if you did actually meet your dates ultimately. Did you, after all of this, start hitting dates? Okay, so as the person who invented Scrum, and what I was thinking at the beginning, this is kind of a litmus test for a really good implementation. So now he's got everything in there pretty much for type B, except I didn't hear a lot of talk about Scrum of Scrums or sprint reviews. Do you have a Scrum of Scrums or a meeting of the team leaders from the 5 teams in different locations? How is that working in Adwords? How do you coordinate across those teams?
We don't have one.
You don't have one. Does it just coordinate by osmosis, or osmotic coordination. Is this a new thing we want to introduce? Does it work well? No, it doesn't work well. So now, actually, Mark told me you're probably thinking about how to do distributed Scrum. So I thought, here's some things to think about next. So I want to talk a little bit about distributed Scrum, outsourced Scrum, Type C Scrum, which we've been talking about. A lot of companies run several teams, and then they'll have the daily meetings. Like over at Palm, they have the daily meetings of like 3 teams, and then right in the same room, they have the Scrums after that. So it's all over in an hour, and each person's only 15 minutes, except for the Scrum Masters. They have to do 2 meetings, their Scrum meeting and the Scrum of Scrums. There are ways to design this, which I don't have time to talk about, to actually make this infinitely scalable. It's a very nifty way to do it. What I want to spend time talking about is distribution. Because you have right now Adwords, assuming you're running a Scrum-like thing in all sites, you have what I call isolated Scrum. Communication only fortunately, Google has better osmotic communication than most companies, which have virtually no osmotic communication. So somehow it sort of works. Ideally, you would do what is viewed as best practice right now in the Agile Alliance, is that you would have a Scrum of Scrums that would meet regularly across those teams, make sure things were coordinated between the teams. They would also roll up the impediment lists and have one common impediment list for the whole organization. It's easier to get, particularly impediments that require company changes, not just team changes. If you have that unified impediment list, it gives you a lot of power. But if you really want to do, Google always wants us to go the next mile, right? So if you really want to get really creative, you might want to consider totally integrated Scrums. Because here's what's happened. Here's an example. Before I get into that, I'm going to talk about an outsourcing example. Here's the metric that I have in my mind in the U.S. companies I've been in. I've said, the boards of directors are always wanting to outsource because we can save money, okay? And if the data shows that by outsourcing to India, on the average, you save 20%. That's across the industry. So you take $2 million worth of development, you send it to India, it gets done to $1.6 million, you save $400,000, the board is really happy, the bottom line looks better. So my argument with them is that every company I've introduced Scrum in, even one that had 600 developers, more than doubled productivity. In fact, I don't even view that as very good. That's kind of a mediocre implementation. Good implementation gets a Toyota effect at least 4 times. It's designed to get it 10 times. If you can just get 240% is what I got at my last company, where I had about 600 developers, that means that I can take that $2 million and do it locally for 0.8. If I send it to an Indian team that's doing waterfall and pay 1.6, how dumb is that? Why would anybody want to do that? You'd always want to introduce good agility locally first, and then go and insist that the Indian teams be agile, and that's what Yahoo is doing. They're converting all of their Indian operation, which is growing bigger than the US operation, to Scrum. If you can bring them on board with Scrum, then, and you can actually execute well, then you can get a real linear increase in productivity by adding people there at lower cost. You can really achieve the benefits. Okay, so good companies, what they're working with, not just the Indians, but the Chinese, the Eastern Europeans, the people in Russia, Dubai, and so forth, trying to get them really on board with this whole Agile process and distributed Agile. Okay, so here's an example. Jack Blount was the CEO of Dynex. It merged with Cersei Dynex, and he had a library application. It ran the whole library, every application in a library, 12,000 sites, 42 countries, 120 million users. Okay, it's a lot of users. Even for Google, this would be a good piece of change. And he had to completely re-implement it, and he knew it was going to be more than 1 million lines of new Java code. He had been CEO or CTO of a dozen companies. He'd done outsourcing in all of them, and in all of them it did not meet his expectations. So he said, I'm going to do it different this time. He started off just working mainly in Utah in January of 2003, and this is thousands of lines of code of Java. So you can look at the increasing lines of code. This is kind of a measure of velocity of the team. There's about a team of about 25, 26 people in Utah. Here they put in some legacy code, so this is an artifact. Once they put it in, you can see the slope is the same. So he said, hey, to get to 1 million lines of code, it's going to be 2010. That is way too far out. I need to pull that in. I need to double the team size, and I need to do it in a way that really radically escalates productivity. So here he brought on 25 people in Russia, in St. Petersburg, and boom, the velocity more than doubled. He got better than linear scalability. It was an XP company that ran this whole implementation as Scrum, distributed Scrum. And the way he ran it was very interesting. He said, I'm not going to have any isolated Scrums. I want everybody on the same page, on the same team. I'm going to have every team split evenly between St. Petersburg and the US and Canada. So the catalog team had 4 people in the United States, 4 people in the United States, 4 people in Russia, and so forth. Even as he had a small search team of 4 people, 2 of them in the United States, 2 in Russia. And he had daily, what he centralized was the Scrum Masters were all in Utah, the product owners were all in Utah, and the architects. So he had some strong centralization that really helped them out. But distributed teams. And so the guys in Russia typically, like a few people, like a Google team of 3 people would come in the morning, they would kind of check in with one another. And by 5:45 in the evening, in the afternoon, they would be talking to the Utah people, 7:45 in Utah. They would be having their 15-minute daily Scrum meeting. They found in order to make that work, they needed to send out email answering the 3 questions before the meeting to solve the language problems, the cultural barriers, make sure everybody was on the same page, and to keep the meeting short. They also had a common tooling environment so everybody could see the burn down worldwide. They built a dashboard that gave them a lot of test data so people could see the state of the project, everybody everywhere all the time. And here's the results. This is the column that is really interesting. Mike Cohn, who you've had here before, wrote a book, has written a couple of books. One of them is on user stories. And in that user story book, he talks about a small team, 6 Java people, who re-implemented a waterfall application with 54 person months of work. The original application was done with 540 person months. So he did it with 1/10 of the resources using Scrum. And if you backtrack that into function points, there are ways to do that. Per developer per month, he got 17.8. The waterfall team was getting 2. The Circe Dynex with a distributed Scrum across continents got 15.3 per developer on a project that was huge compared to this is just a little project. So on a large distributed outsourced project, they got almost the same performance as 6 people locally in the same room. Not bad. So maybe this is a googly thing to think about. And finally, there's just last, I think I've got 1 or 2 slides. You might think about the type ABC Scrum issue that I try. Here's Ryan Martins, who's the president of Rally Development, kind of put this chart together after hearing me talk about this. And he said, the people start off, they have releases that take a lot of iterations, fixed lengths, cycle time for new requests may be 4 to 6 months. When they start to get organized, they shorten the cycle to 2 to 3 months. And they're concerned about managing the product portfolio. and they smooth out the work so there's a steady flow, there's never any stoppage. But you can take it farther than that. You can get the entire organization involved. You can start releasing every sprint. You can do multiple overlapping sprints. You can change the cycle time to weeks and months. At PatientKeeper, we said, what do the customers really need? For a critical issue, they need a new release this week. For the customers we wanted to bring on live, we typically wanted 4 or 5 new customers a month. We need a new release every month that has all those extra features that these new customers want. So our whole system's designed to put out multiple weekly iterations a month, plus at least one big monthly release. And our major new applications typically take 3 months to get the first release. Those are thought of as pieces of those monthly. So they emerge out of those monthly iterations. So as a result, we always have 4 streams flowing through the teams simultaneously. This gives us tremendous traction. We were able to do 45 major releases a year, and those are big go-live kinds of things at big institutions. And I haven't found any other companies that can do that, certainly not in healthcare. So this is kind of the picture. You know, we've got these weekly things going on, we've got these monthly things going on, and conceptually we have this 3-month release going on all the time. And here's how our burn down is managed. Over the years, we found that we like to see the work burning down, but we want to manage. Here's the blue is new things coming in every day. Maybe they're new bugs, maybe the product owner has slipped something in there. We want to see what's coming new, and here we want to see what's closed. So the yellow better be bigger than the blue, or we know we're in trouble. It gives us very early warning on trouble. Also, we like to manage the cumulative tasks in QA, because QA has to burn to 0 at the same time development does in order to go live. Okay? So we're watching to make sure that QA doesn't get out of whack. And then finally, this was the first chart that we actually got a good fix on. We started with 150. This is number of tasks, which they're average a day in size, so it's about 150 days of work. We started with 150 days for 150 tasks, and here we are almost to the end, and we've closed almost 400. We're going to close 450 by the time we're done. So it showed us that you have to do 3 times as many things as you think when you start, thus confirming the Fred Brooks' mythical man-month assertion that things always take 3 times as long as the developer estimates. Okay. The beauty of Agile is it allows you to inspect and adapt such that you can actually overcome that. Okay? But this is the first data I've seen that actually graphically shows that problem. And so now we can plan for it. So I think, did I get through that in 45 minutes? A little bit more. Okay. So we wanted to have a little bit of time for questions, comments, thoughts. How many people are actually doing what you would call Agile now here at Google? It looks like maybe about half of you. Some of you at Adwords you're not raising your hands. So probably about half of you. Yeah. Is it working for you? Yeah, managers really like it. Agile is really good for managers. Yeah.
How do you suggest using Scrum in a scenario where you have a complex program, where you have lots of small projects that some of them overlap, some of them are related, some of them are completely unrelated? I can see how in the factory model it works great with this. You have a team focused on building a single product, and you can jam it through the serial factory process, but if you've got the same developer working on sometimes completely different projects as part of a program, you have the example where you could have like 3 or 4 scrums in a day, but that may not be practical. It's practical if it's all the same people, if it's dedicated to a project. So what we do is we do a meeting twice a week. Like we have a meta scrum on
the question is, suppose you have multiple projects being done simultaneously by the same people. How do you manage that? You really have this problem of multi-threading through the same people. At PatientKeeper, we have multi-threading not only through individuals, but also through teams as well. So you have a type C Scrum problem. That means you've got to get really good at Scrum to execute this well. But we could maybe talk about this offline later. But you need to figure out how to implement a type C Scrum. I think the major thing we've found in that instance is you do have to have regular meetings of the whole. You're doing it twice a week, so that's a good start, where everything kind of gets coordinated. All the pieces are made sure they're in place. Any other questions, comments? How many of you who are not doing Agile processes now are maybe thinking about, might do it? Some of you? Maybe about half of the remainder.
So,
yeah.
Questions. I liked your real-world data, sort of benchmarks, function points for developers. Can you tell us, is there any other technology out there that can bring an organization to the same level of performance?
The question is there anything else that can bring an organization to the same level of performance as Scrum? Rather than just saying no outright, let me tell you, I'm working now with a CMM level 5 organization, something that Google would never think about. It took them 7 years to get to CMM level 5. That means that everybody's using the same process. All processes are monitored. They've got so much data, I can ask them any question, and they can give me 3 answers from 3 different data sets. The thing about CMMI maturity levels is it's designed to reduce rework. CMMI level 1 companies, which is most companies, have about 50% rework. That's bugs and stuff that has to be redone because it's not right. By the time you get to CM level 5, you have only 10% or less rework. You've added about 10% overhead for process management. You haven't increased the productivity of the real work. So they spent 7 years to bring their rework from 50% to 10%. It improved their productivity by about 25%. They then introduced Scrum. They immediately cut their defect rate by 40%. They were already really low. They cut their planning overhead by 80%. And they doubled their productivity, and now they are bidding contracts out. To the Defense Department in the US, for example, if they want waterfall, it costs them $10 million. If they want Scrum, it costs them $5 million. And they've only been doing it 6 months. I think they can go all the way like Toyota and get it twice as much. So what I can say is I have real data that shows that Scrum can take the most mature company in the world and fix it. And I haven't seen anybody else that has that kind of data.
But what if a company has the same feature, the same benchmark already by using their own, methodology?
I think that Scrum is like Toyota. Toyota has this team that will go around the world helping companies be better. And they did an experiment some years ago where they said, let's find the most agile company in the United States. And they found this industrial process control company that had won all kinds of Agile awards. And they sent the Toyota team in there. In 6 months, they doubled everything. I mean, it's just like the Scrum example. They did exactly what I described Scrum did to the CM Level 5 company. So my view is that there's no company that Toyota can't fix. I don't care how good it is. And fixing it means they will double every metric in a positive way. And I think Scrum can do the same thing. It's based on the same concepts as lean manufacturing is. And I have some data that other people don't have, so I get to say it. Other comments, questions, thoughts? Yeah, okay, we need a break now? Okay. Thanks for being here. A great opportunity.